I want to begin by thanking those of you who made a point of being here as our conservative Masorti movement declared this as a Shabbat of solidarity with Israel. Of course, I think every day since October 7th, our people have been showing their solidarity in many, many ways. I hope you had a chance to see the handout. If not, they're laying around, I'm sure, that describe it was written just as we were leaving Israel. It was written by Jacob Blumenthal, who's the CEO of our Rabbinical Assembly, the International Organization of Conservative Rabbis, and also the CEO of the United Synagogue, which is the organization of about 650 synagogues in North America. And then he graciously added, I did get a chance to just look at it and give him some feedback before it was published, but he graciously added the names of the 5 of us who were on this mission that I want to reflect on today. What it doesn't reflect is that the trip began not on Tuesday when we left for Israel, but on Tuesday afternoon, but rather on Tuesday morning, when there was a very powerful gathering in Washington, D.C. It was a gathering for Jewish leaders who came from all over the country, leaders of our federations who gathered that morning and announced a $500 million campaign that our community was organizing in response to what happened on October 7th. And a campaign that's moving forward, $10 million in this community, and I know it's led by Mike and Linda Fitterman of our congregation, and I know that people have been responding with incredible generosity to that and many other important causes that need to be supported at this time. It was a powerful moment. It wasn't clear to me if I could actually make it because of the timing of my flight. I didn't know when I was actually going to get on a plane until Saturday night, and to my surprise, my flight was at 5:30, so I couldn't actually make it until I found the flight from Reagan National Airport to JFK that would get me to New York just in time to get on my flight. As I said, it was very powerful to be at the Synagogue 6 and I in Washington. Many, many members of Congress were there as well. We were addressed by the leaders of Congress on the Senate side, by Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. Chuck Schumer had just gotten back from another senatorial mission, and he had to leave early to consult with President Biden, who announced he was leaving the next day as well. Representative Hakeem Jeffrey and Steve Scalise from the House, all of them gave very strong messages of support for Israel, as he had just sustained a devastating, barbarous attack by Hamas on October 7th. Each passing day has made it ever more clear that the full intention of that attack was to instill terror by perpetrating atrocities on civilians in Israel, and that it was successful. At that service, I really wanted to be there if I could, and I was able to. I had the privilege of offering the prayer for the return of the hostages, which you heard me recite earlier. And as soon as I finished, I scooted out the door to catch my flight. Now, the trip that I went on, to be clear, was organized by the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, a body I sit on because of my role as a leader of the Rabbinical Assembly. It's an organization with tremendous access in Israel. And when I was there in February, it provided an opportunity then to meet with top Israeli leaders such as President Herzog, Prime Minister Netanyahu. And this time I actually had no idea what the agenda was or what we would do. I just knew that we were asked to show up and I had to be there. Actually, the trip, I discovered as we were already in the air that we in fact would meet with President Herzog, Prime Minister Netanyahu and his chief advisor, Ron Dermer, Foreign Minister Eli Cohen, and his senior spokesperson who showed up at the UN this past week with family of hostages. As well, the meeting involved citizens most impacted personally by the attack. As I conveyed in the Twin Cities Jew Folk interview that appeared yesterday, first of all, when I spoke that day, I said I didn't know if I'd actually make it. I didn't really fully believe I would be there until I landed. But that Saturday night, the ticket on El Al appeared in my email, which was kind of striking given how hard it was to get a ticket at that point. How was it that 50 Jewish leaders were going to be prioritized? I did some serious soul searching about why and other Jewish community leaders should take a seat on El Al, a seat which was so precious as reservists sought to return to their units and families tried desperately to get back to Israel, to be there for their own families and others. The best I could come up with to justify it was we needed to deliver the message that our American Jewish community, our organizations, the people we represent, stand by Israel at its time of need. As soon as I landed, I was glad that I had gone. The message we were delivering of solidarity with Israel was deeply appreciated, especially at such a difficult time. One person whose arrival was even more deeply appreciated by Israelis was President Joe Biden, as I learned that Air Force One landed 10 minutes before my flight. And I think he was welcomed even more. When I got to Jerusalem, I got to see friends, very dear friends who are like family in Jerusalem, and hear their assessment of the situation. The first formal meeting I had was with rabbinic colleagues, Masorti rabbis in Israel, who came to visit with us. And I know how much stress rabbis in diaspora are feeling as we support our people at this difficult time, as it is so personal to all of us, even in the diaspora. Right? As I mentioned, I look around the room, there are people who have family, friends. There's not more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation from those who have been killed, taken hostage, had to flee from their homes, or be called up for military service. Imagine how much the more so the stress of this responsibility being felt by our Israeli rabbinic colleagues who carry this grief and concern even more closely. Among the rabbis who were with us is a rabbinic couple, Nava and Yerach Meyersdorf, graduates of our Schechter Seminary in Jerusalem. One year at the high holidays, I mentioned Nava who had served as a rabbinic intern at our sister synagogue, Magen Avraham in Omer, together with Yos Baruch Fromer, who's now the rabbi of that congregation. For years, we have supported, as a congregation, those rabbinic interns that now serve with such distinction. Last October, Yos was here and spoke to us brilliantly. Nava serves as the outreach rabbi now for the Masorti synagogue based at our movement's Fuchsburg Center at the center of Jerusalem. One of the stories that she mentioned referenced a room next door that we had passed as we were joining in for a meeting, which reflected the fact that there are 100 families who fled their homes on the Gaza border and have had to find refuge. Fuchsburg, at its own expense, took in 100 families, and I got to peek in to see mothers playing with their children. Nava told a story about a Haredi family that's there. There are others, right? There's no distinctions being made about who's there or where help will come from. And a Haredi man who made a point of saying how grateful he was and how he recognized that this was a conservative Masorti institution, one that a Haredi might not even be willing to walk into on another day. And when she responded, like, no, this is not the time to talk about those differences. He said, no, this is exactly the time to recognize that those differences don't matter the way we thought they did. During this past week, there have been so many people, colleagues, friends in Israel with whom I've been in touch. I thought back to a dinner last February when I was in Israel on another conference of President's tour under such different circumstances when Israel was convulsing with demonstrations in the streets over the attempts to radically change the judiciary branch. And I had this lovely dinner with friends, including Alan and Sheila Warshawski, who was a longtime president of the Magen Avraham and of the Masorti movement in Israel for a period. So I wrote them just to check in, and she wrote back, "Thank you so much for your supportive words." I read this with her permission. "It is a very difficult time now. Most of our grandchildren and partners are now on active duty. Our children are doing home front stuff. We hosted Aaron Trone, wife Susie, and 2 teenage children during Shiva time. I'll come back to tell you more about who these names mean, who they are. The Fort funeral was this afternoon. Our rabbi, I assume Yos, conducted the funeral. Hundreds attended. My son-in-law's nephew was captured with his superior officer the first morning. So that family is sitting and waiting for the news. A good friend from Habonim days, Vivian Silver of Kibbutz Be'eri, is missing. Yehoshua Lior, member of our Masorti congregation in Jerusalem and dear friend, his grandson was killed at the event. He was the lead DJ at the festival that was happening and was attacked. He went to the funeral up north at his moshav. There is no end in sight. We go to our shelter when there is a siren. Tonight we are gathering at Magen Avraham. Thanks again for your comforting words, Sheila." So let me tell you more about those names and what she's referencing, and again, the close personal ties we have. Our synagogue, as I said, has had a long relationship with Magen Avraham, whose founding rabbi is Rabbi Michael Kravitz, who used to come to this community on his way to his hometown of Lincoln. And I believe that Rabbi Goodman was helpful in securing the gift that enabled them to build their first building right after the Yom Kippur War. Since then, our congregants have paid for 2 security rooms of the congregation. I remember hearing from their Rabbi Gil Nativ in a previous time when rockets were falling on the area, how he was to do a wedding, and the wedding could go on because they were able to take safety in that security room. And the second one we built in 2003, or we paid for between 2003 and 2005. Since 2005, our congregation, our people, have supported rabbinic interns from our movement's Schechter Rabbinical School in Jerusalem. I assume the rabbi, who Sheila mentioned, as having done the funeral for Nir Fort Zal, who was found at his apartment having been murdered, is Yos Baruch Frommer of Magen Avraham. And I was struck when I learned from Shai Avni, who spoke at our community event, and at the one time was the educator of that synagogue, that Nir was one of 17s who visited our congregation when we hosted them years ago during a summer visit. At that time, Rabbi Sadoff was on our staff, and he was the one who helped Cindy and me to host these teenagers. And interestingly, the kids fell in love with him, and it was because of them that they went back, and at the time they were looking for a new rabbi, and they said, "You must hire Rabbi Yonatan." And in fact, they gave him an interview, and he went off and spent 5 years as their rabbi. Rabbi Sadoff is now serving as a rabbi in Melbourne, Australia. And when I reached him this week, he told me that he officiated at the bat mitzvah of the Shira Tron Matis, which is the family mentioned in Sheila's letter. You may have heard their story. The grandfather, who I believe, as we heard, is in Omer with his wife, was a distinguished professor of Israel Studies at Brandeis University. His daughter and son-in-law, Deborah Shachar Tron Matias and Shlomi Matias, had just returned from vacation in Amsterdam on October 6th. They were murdered shielding their 16-year-old son Rotem, who thankfully survived. Rabbi Sadaf remembers them as an amazing couple, and even the pictures on Facebook from their vacation in Amsterdam reminded him how vital and how much in love they were. All of this underscores how personal this is for all of us. When I got back, people have asked me what I encountered in the mood of the country. There are many feelings, but we can't dismiss the intense anger that people are feeling, grappling with the question of how this massacre could have taken place and how the IDF could have been so slow and ineffective in stopping the attack. One farmer who had lived on the envelope, Gaza envelope as it's called, voiced what I heard from others, that the IDF was not there because they were on the West Bank at the bidding of settlers who were provoking Palestinians there. There is profound anger at Prime Minister Netanyahu for the way he has split the country to maintain power and brought the worst extremists into his coalition. As I said, there were 39 successive weeks of protest against the ruling coalition's attempt to undermine Israel's judicial system. It was especially galling that those protesters were accused of being traitors because the people who took to the streets in regular protests and reservists declined to show up for military service. Well, once the war broke out, Israel largely closed ranks. I consistently heard people comment on the deep disappointment they continue to have for the government, which remains in disarray. It is the organizations of civil society, the same ones who had effectively, so powerfully coordinated the protests to uphold Israeli democracy, that are now being credited widely with organizing tremendous support in an instant for citizens whose lives have been upended. But make no mistake, the attack has created deep resolve. The claims labeling Israel as a colonial settler state badly misread the reality of what Israel stands for and the commitment Jews maintain to the continued vitality of a Jewish state. Particularly moving during this week were the meetings our group had with people whose lives have been most directly upended. The first meeting was with the families of those being held hostage. They included John Polin and Rachel Goldberg, who you may have seen Rachel speaking at the UN this past week. I learned when I put a call into Rabbi Rob Kahn, as you may remember Rob and Camille from their years when he served as Rabbi Bethel and have since made Aliyah, how close the Kahns are with the Goldberg-Polin family. You can go on Facebook and see Rob speaking about Hirsch, who they considered like a nephew, as he implored us not to forget Hirsch and those being held hostage. Certainly one of the most powerful moments of my rabbinate of all my years was I had the privilege of being able to offer the prayer for the release of those held hostage in the presence of those families. The next day, amidst our meetings with government leaders, with the foreign minister, with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with President Herzog, most powerfully was a visit to Hadassah Hospital at Ein Kerem, because among our group was the CEO of Hadassah, and extraordinary to see the work that they do. It was there that you may see a picture of me in the TC Jew folk. We heard from a Hadassah nurse named Michal, clearly a Haredi woman with 10 children. Her mother was sitting by her, clearly a secular woman. As Michal described, having gone for the weekend on vacation with her husband and children to the Gaza border just to spend the holiday. And she was caught separated from her family. And during that moment, she was able to tend to an Israeli woman soldier who had been badly wounded and who since survived. After she presented, and it was just heart-wrenching, and she described really the miraculous, her miraculous survival and the fact that Hadassah doctors were able to save her arm. I offered to do a Mishaberach. Similar to Mishaberach, I would offer to those who are sick and in need of healing. But I was really careful because, I'm a conservative rabbi and this was a Haredi woman. So I made a point of saying, "You're sure you're okay with it?" as I whispered it to her. And she wasn't fazed because she appreciated a heartfelt prayer for her complete recovery. I look back at the messages I delivered the Shabbat before I left for Israel, and I don't want to repeat them, but they feel to me to stand up well about what's happened and what we need to do. I think it was really important as we delivered messages to Israeli leaders, there was a recognition that we are very diverse in our views about what needs to happen. But we were unified around the message that we are here to show up for Israel, and we were unified in delivering the message of not forgetting the hostages, which they asked us to deliver to Israeli leadership. I also felt, with many others, the need to reinforce the message I delivered before I left about how critically important it is that Israel make every effort to be mindful of not only the humanitarian importance of care and how it operates, but the strategic importance, as Israel's reputation will be tarnished. It's a very difficult thing to accomplish at a time when there is wide agreement and people are resolute about the need to negate the capacity of Hamas to control Gaza or ever again conduct such an attack. So I know people are thinking, what can we do? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Take a look at the sheet. There are other places you can turn to for lists of things that we can do at this time. If you need help thinking about that, please feel free to speak to any of us, clergy here, and we'll help you figure out a response that makes sense in your circumstances. I am thankful, I will tell you, to have heard before I left and since from colleagues of other faiths who did not hesitate to express their disgust at the barbarity of the massacre. And I understand their concern for the horrendous toll now being experienced by Palestinians as Israel combats Hamas, which intentionally embeds itself amidst civilians. And we cannot lose sight of the fact that Israel is fighting a war that is more than about the Palestinians. It is very much directed by Iran, which has made no secret of its genocidal intent to destroy the Jewish state. I believe that Israel has no choice but to defeat this enemy and to reestablish its deterrence capacity that was badly damaged on October 7th. And so that brings me back to today's Torah reading, to this parsha, to chapter 14, which is so out of character for the story of Abraham that we read today. Abraham in chapter 14 is not acting as in the mode of a faith leader or a founder of a Jewish people. Abraham is acting as a military commander, determined to return his nephew Lot, who was taken captive. This foreshadows the rabbinic mandate for freeing hostages, As the great medieval Rabbi Maimonides stated forcefully, there is no mitzvah as great as the redemption of captives. Ein lecha mitzvah rabbah kifidyon shvuyim. As I said, chapter 14 of the book of Genesis is exceptional. Avram arises as a military leader to save Lot. And he does so, if you read to the end of the story, in a way that's very careful about the ethical dimension. He doesn't want any of the booty that comes from the success. That's not why he did it. He did it to save his nephew. It's so interesting to me, if you looked back at chapter 13, what happened right before that story? They had a falling out. They were in such conflict that they had to separate. They couldn't even live together. And yet here, we see that Abraham understands his role. And it's here that Abraham was identified as Abraham the Ivri, the other. But the focus is not on how Abraham is in tension with others, but rather his responsibility to his people. And it's in this book that we read about the birth of his family, but very much the birth of a Jewish people with all of its mishigas, all of its craziness. What I take from this is the message of solidarity. There is nothing more important at this time than showing up, and that in all our actions it's time to express our solidarity, even as we will find it tested and challenged by the difficulties that lie ahead. The lessons for me this week, that this is the time when we have to show up for Israel and for each other. Shabbat Shalom.